Hi, thank you for joining me. I'm Mindy Mandell, and in this video I'm going to continue reading Plato's Statesman. And as I've been doing throughout this series, I am using the collected dialogues of Plato. And once again, the translator is J.B. Skimp. I do want to remind you of a question that came up early on in the section that we read last week. This question was raised. The stranger asked why there must be a system of laws, seeing that law is not the ideal form of control. We must find out why a legal system is necessary, he says. However, this question was not really addressed because the bulk of what we focused on in that last section looked at the ideal ruler who rules without any written laws. And you might recall that what we saw last week, what we ended with, and this is 297D, is that there is only one constitution in the true sense, and it was the one that was described in that previous section. And he goes on to say that as for the rest of them, they owe their very preservation to their following a code of laws enacted for this true state and to a strict adherence to the rule which we admit to be desirable, though it falls short of the ideal. And he called this second best. This is the justest and most desirable course as a second best, when the ideal that we have just described has been set aside. And so he says here, this is where we ended with, we must now go on to say how this state of affairs we have just called second best is achieved in practice. Must we not? And young Socrates agreed, and that is where we're going today. So now we're looking at, you can see this is page 1068. This is page 1068 in this text, and this is 297E. And it starts off, let us go back once again to the parallel cases with which we have constantly to compare the ruler who really is a statesman. Who are they? Our good friend the ship's captain and the doctor with a dozen other men. Let us picture to ourselves a situation in which they might find themselves and see how it all works out in their case. What situation? Suppose we all suddenly decided that we are the victims of the worst possible outrages at their hands. Every doctor you see can preserve the life of any he will among us, and can hurt any he will by knife or cautery, or by demanding fees which are nothing but imposed taxes. For only the tiniest portion of them is spent on medicaments for the patient, and all the rest goes to keep the doctor and his household. Their final enormity is to accept bribes from the patient's relations or from his enemies and put him to death. Ship's captains are guilty of a different set of crimes, but they are just as heinous. They will enter into a conspiracy to put out to sea with you and then leave you stranded, or else they will scuttle the ship and throw the passengers overboard. And these are not all their misdeeds. Suppose we formed this view of doctors and captains and then held a council at which of the following decree was passed. Neither medicine nor seamanship must be entrusted in future with absolute control in its particular sphere, either over slaves or over free citizens. We therefore resolve to gather together an assembly of all, or of the wealthy among the people. It shall be lawful for men of no calling or men of any other calling to advise this assembly on seamanship and medicine. That is to say, on the drugs and surgical instruments appropriate to the treatment of the sick, on ships and their tackle, on the handling of vessels, and on perils of the sea, including risks arising from wind and tide, risks arising from encountering pirates, and risks arising from maneuver of warships against enemy warships in the event of a naval engagement. So much for the decree on these matters. The executive is to embody this decree to the assembly of the people, based, you remember, on the advice of a few doctors and sailors, maybe, but certainly on the advice of many unqualified people, too, in laws which they are to inscribe on tablets of wood and of stone, and in the case of some of the rules so resolved upon, they must see that they find their place among the unwritten ancestral customs. Thereafter, forever, medicine and navigation may only be practiced according to these laws and customs. And I just want to point out here that again, this term ancestral customs shows up. And so you want to be thinking about what that refers to. Well, young Socrates says that's a pretty state of affairs, this. But we have not done yet. Suppose that they resolve further to appoint magistrates chosen by lot annually from the citizen body, whether from the wealthy only or from all citizens. Some of these magistrates, once they are appointed, are to take command of ships and navigate them. Others are to cure the sick according to the written code. Oh, this is getting worse. But we have not done. See what follows. When the year of office of each of these magistrates expires, a court must be established and a jury chosen by lot, perhaps from among wealthier citizens whose names are on a list of previously selected jurors, perhaps from the people as a whole. The magistrates are to be summoned before this court, and it is to subject them to audit. It is open to anyone to lay an accusation against them that during their year of office they failed to sail the ships according to the written laws or the ancient custom of our forebears. Similar charges may be brought concerning the healers of the sick. If the verdict goes against any of them, the court must assess the penalty or the fine the convicted parties must pay. Well then, the man who took office voluntarily in such a society would deserve any punishment and any fine that might be imposed. Then there can be further misdemeanors, and we must enact a law to provide against them. It will be a law against independent research. I'm going to come back to that. If a man be found guilty of inquiry into seamanship or medicine in contravention of this law, of inquiry into nautical practice, for instance, or into climatic influences and bodily temperatures, and especially if he be guilty of airing theories of his own on such things, action must be taken to suppress him. First, we must deny him the title of doctor or captain. Instead, we must call him a man with his head in the clouds, one of these chattering sophists. Furthermore, it will be lawful for any citizen so desiring to indict him before a court of justice, or what passes for such a court, on the charge of corrupting the younger men and influencing them to go in for seamanship and medicine in an illegal manner by setting up as doctors or captains on their own authority. If he is found guilty of influencing young or old against the laws and written enactments, he shall suffer the utmost penalties, for there can be no claim to possess wisdom greater than the wisdom of the laws. No one need be ignorant of seamanship or medicine, of sailing regulations or health regulations. The laws are there, written out for our conning. The ancient customs are firmly established in our midst. Anyone who really desires to learn may learn. Let's go back over this. First of all, there'll be a law against independent research. For some reason, I cannot underline the dependent part, but pretend it's all underlined. So there'll be a law against independent research. What does that mean? Well, you can see, at least on the surface here, we can at least recognize that it means there's no innovation. You cannot think for yourself. So this is a very dogmatic society that's being described here. If you inquire and want to learn and better understand for yourself, oh no, you're going to jail, you're going to be put down. You'll be guilty, especially if he be guilty of airing theories of his own. Okay, that above all is not allowed in what he's describing here. A man with his head in the clouds, one of those chattering sophists. A contemporary of Socrates was a man named Aristophanes, and he was a famous playwright in his day. And to this day, if you check online for The Clouds by Aristophanes, you can find a free English translation of it. And it's a humorous, he's a very clever man. It's a humorous dialogue. But it's very clear in that dialogue that he is mocking Socrates, that he sees him as some weird mystic who's like flying his head in the clouds. So that seems to be what is alluded to here. Also, we see this idea of going before a court of justice on the charge of corrupting the youth. Sound familiar, anyone? You can see that Plato is taking some jabs here. He's resentful of what happened to his teacher. Clearly so. But the stress here is this idea of doing things on one's own authority. And if you're found guilty, you suffer the utmost penalties, as Socrates unfortunately did. And so you see there that there's this idea that the laws are already written. You don't need to learn anything. You don't need to think for yourself. Just follow the laws that are already written. You do not have the ability to understand it yourself. Whoever wrote these laws, they were special people, chosen people. The rest of us cannot do it. That's the idea. That's the mentality of what is captured here. Now he goes on to ask, suppose, Socrates, that all the arts are treated like this. How do you imagine that generalship and hunting in all its forms would be affected? What would happen to painting and other representational arts, or to building and manufacture of all types of implements under such conditions? And how could farming or any cultivation whatever be carried on? Imagine the rearing of horses and other animals tied down to legal prescription, or divination and similar ministerial functions so controlled. What would legally governed drafts be like? Or legal mathematics, whether simple arithmetic, plane geometry, stereometry, or kinematics. Stereometry, by the way, is a subdiscipline of chemistry. It's studying the spatial arrangement of atoms. And as you can tell, I didn't know that. I have a little note here. Maybe some of you are familiar with that field. Kinematics is a subdivision of physics, and you can probably guess from the root of that word, it's the study of motion. Okay, what would the world be like if everything worked on this principle, organized throughout according to written laws instead of according to the relevant arts? And young Socrates replies that it is quite clear that the arts as we know them would be annihilated, and that they would never be resurrected because of this law which puts an embargo on all research. The result would be that life, which is hard enough as it is, would be quite impossible then, and not to be endured. Yes, but there is a further possible degradation to consider. Suppose we compel each of these arts to function according to a legal code, and place a magistrate in charge of this code, either by election or by the fall of the lot. and make him rule according to it. Suppose then that he has no regard for the code and acts only from motives of ambition and favoritism. He embarks on a course of action contrary to law, but does not act on any basis of scientific knowledge. As evil as the former state was, will not this latter one be still worse? Okay, so now we're comparing. First, there's the state that's governed by the law, but very strictly. And now we have the person whose motives are ambition and favoritism. This person goes against the law, caring only about themselves. And he says this one would be still worse. And young Socrates agrees it will indeed. The laws which have been laid down represent the fruit of experience. One must admit that. Each of them has been put forward by some advocate who has been fortunate enough to hit on the right method of commending it, and who has thus persuaded the public assembly to enact it. Any man who dares by his action to infringe these laws is guilty of a wrong many times greater than the wrong done by strict laws. For such transgression, if tolerated, would do even more than a rigid code to pervert all ordered activity. Okay, so the laws as they're written are the fruit of experience. So on the political level, you can imagine that these are politicians who are knowledgeable, who have experience in politics, and who are writing laws that are wise and good in that field, for that level of being. But when we're talking about true wisdom, when we're talking about the kind of wisdom that we talk about in philosophy, or certainly in Platonism, then we have a different kind of experience. And so there's a special kind of experience that the philosopher who has reached this peak, if you will have been able to enjoy. And the understanding of such experience is the development of wisdom. And so the laws written down by this person, those philosophical laws in the soul, when you're focused on that which is true and real, the good, the just, and the beautiful, the person focused on that, the kind of laws that that person writes, they are the fruit of experience. And so when you see it on these two levels, you can think about it in both ways. Young Socrates agrees, yes, of course it would. Then so long as men enact laws and written codes governing any department of life, our second best method of government is to forbid any individual or any group to perform any act in contravention of these laws. True. Then laws would seem to be written copies of scientific truth in the various departments of life that they cover. Copies based as far as possible on the instructions received from those who really possess the scientific truth on these matters. And so there you have the answer to the question, why do we even need written laws? And that's because very few people are able to function in that ideal way of the truly enlightened philosopher. And so the next best thing is to follow the written laws. And so what we're seeing here is a little bit softer in some ways, a little bit softer version, although there is quite a dogmatic feeling to that previous page. Back here, certainly, this was describing dogma. But where he's going here by contrasting it with the person who's only motivated by ambition and favoritism, it does give a softer feel, I think, to what he's describing here. And here you can imagine maybe a person who is a Platonist, for example, and lives according to these teachings and tries as much as possible to, as much as they're capable of, to live according to the virtues and to act from excellence. Or we think of the person who follows Hinduism or Buddhism or any other spiritual system with in a way that is with integrity and with seriousness and is genuinely trying to be good and to live according to that system. In any such situation, that would be the person who's got the second best situation here. That would be the softer version of the dogma. That would be the harsher way of seeing that second, what he's calling the second best method. If you follow very, very strictly, then you could fall into that dogma. But there is a way of being a little more flexible, perhaps, but still following the laws, but letting them flow, not being I should be careful how I say that. You're staying to the letter of what is written, but you're always looking at yourself and adjusting your own behavior to see if you can better fit it, because we're always, we're works, we're works in progress, so to say. Young Socrates agrees, yes, of course. And yet we must never lose sight of the truth we stated before, that the one with real knowledge, the true statesman, will in many instances allow his activities to be dictated by his art and pay no regard to written prescriptions. He will do this whenever he is convinced that there are measures which are better than the instructions he previously wrote and sent to people at a time when he could not be there to control them personally. Yes, that is what we said before. Okay, so now we have two different people who are not following the rules. One of them in the way that is better than following the rules, and one in a way that is worse. And so that's where he has to look. Okay, so an individual or a group who possess a code of laws but try to introduce some change in them because they consider it an improvement are doing the same thing according to their lights as the true statesman. Yes. But if they acted like this with minds unenlightened by knowledge, they would indeed try to copy the true original, but they would copy it very badly. If, on the other hand, they possessed scientific knowledge, it would no longer be a case of copying at all. It would be the real and original statesmanship we are talking about. Yes, or so I should say. Let me maybe say a word or two about this just to make sure that we all understand what he's saying here. Is that many of us, for example, in our practice, we want to make some innovations that we think is better for our lives. To the degree that you have knowledge, to the degree you've had some experience and, the special kind of experience that he's talking about here, to the degree you've had that experience and you've matured it in your soul, then you will find yourself naturally being innovative. Every teacher has their own style, right? Every teacher has their own approach and their way of talking about and relating to truth. You don't have to perfectly copy your teacher. Your teacher also did not copy his or her teacher, and so on. Everybody has their own style. But to the degree that you fall short of enlightenment, then your efforts to innovate are not going to just be another expression of truth. It's going to be something less than. And so that's what he's describing here. With minds that are unenlightened, the copy is going to be, you're going to copy very badly. But if you have the scientific knowledge, then it's not a copy at all. That is your own expression of original statesmanship. Well, now it has been argued already, and we have agreed that no large group of men is capable of acquiring any art, be it what you will. That stands as our agreed conclusion. Got this one piece of hair that keeps falling in my face. All right. Granted, then, that an art of kingly rule exists, the wealthy group or the whole citizen body would never be able to acquire this scientific art of statesmanship. How could they? It seems to follow that there is an invariable rule which these imitative constitutions must obey if they mean to reproduce as far as they can that one real constitution, which is government by a real statesman using real statecraft. They must all keep strictly to the laws once they've been laid down, and never transgress written enactments or establish national customs. Now notice here that national customs is different from ancestral customs. So here, national customs is something positive laid down by the true statesman in these written laws. Ancestral customs is something different. When the wealthy seek to copy the ideal constitution, we call the constitution which results aristocracy. But when they disregard the laws, the constitution produced is oligarchy. I suppose so. But when one individual governs according to laws, imitating the truly wise ruler, we call him king. We make no difference in name between the individual ruler guided by political science and the individual ruler guided by a right opinion and acting according to the laws. But what we're calling the king for this next leg of the discussion is the one who is imitating the truly wise ruler. Now he says the one who is the truly wise ruler is also called king, right? We make no difference in name between the two. But for this next leg of the discussion, the focus is on the one who is the imitator, because we're looking at different names of those who fall short of the ideal, but who follow the laws to some degree. Okay, so I cannot highlight the word aristocracy for some reason. So this yellow is for both aristocracy and oligarchy. It's going to do double duty there. So we've got aristocracy, oligarchy, and king so far. And young Socrates says that seems to be so. And so if there really were an example of a truly wise ruler in power, his name would undoubtedly be the same, the king. It could not be anything else. So the total of the names of the constitutions now under consideration come to 5 only. So it seems. We've only seen 3 of them so far. So hold on. But stay, what of the case where one man rules but does not govern his actions either by laws or by ancient customs, but claims falsely what only the truly wise ruler has a right to claim, and says that the best course must be taken in defiance of written codes, if in fact it is only his passion and his ignorance that lead him to attempt to copy the true statesman in his defiance of law. Must we not call him and all like him by the name of tyrant? So only his passion and his ignorance are guiding him. And he is copying the true statesman, not in every way, but particularly in the defiance of law, in that neither one of them are following the written laws, is specifically the way I take that one, because the true statesman does follow law, but it's an unwritten law. And this is his definition. This is Plato's definition of the tyrant. Young Socrates says, unquestionably. So now we have the tyrant and the king, and then oligarchy and aristocracy. And then he didn't mention it on the previous page, but earlier in this dialogue, we saw democracy as well. I'll highlight that one as well. Democracy, all of which arise when men turn down the idea of one true and scientific ruler. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so here we have the same 5 constitutions that were mentioned back at 291 and 2. It says that we have the tyrant and the king, the oligarchy and aristocracy, and then democracy, all of which arise when men turn down the idea of the one true and scientific ruler. Notice that if all of these are less than the one true and scientific ruler, it means that the king, as discussed here, must be then the one who is imitating, not the true king. Men doubt whether any man will ever be found fit to bear such perfect rule. They despair of finding any one man willing and able to rule with moral and intellectual insight, and to render every man his due with strictest fairness. They feel sure that a man with such absolute power will be bound to employ it to the hurt and injury of his personal enemies and to put them out of the way. But it remains true that if the ideal ruler we have described were to appear on earth, he would be acclaimed, and he would spend his days guiding in strictest justice and perfect felicity that one and only true commonwealth worthy of the name. That is so, of course. We must take things as they are, however, and kings do not arise in cities in the natural course of things in the way the royal bee is born in a beehive. One individual obviously outstanding in body and mind and capable of taking charge of things at once. And therefore it seems men gather together and work out written codes, chasing as fast as they can the fading vision of the true constitution. So it would seem. It's a nice paragraph here. So there is not, you're not a chosen one, right? Any one of us is entirely capable of waking up. It is our birthright, after all. We don't just pop out of the womb ready to lead. And so men gather together and work out written codes, chasing as fast as they can the fading vision of the true constitution. This can be taken in a number of levels. So, of course, on the political level, there's the idea that the founding fathers, for example, they left us not only the Constitution, but also many of their notes. And we study those and we try as best we can to hold on to that vision that they had. We also can see this, within spiritual communities. The founders had a very profound vision, and somebody like Plato or Buddha or Socrates, they have a vision, they have their teachings, and the students around them. Hopefully, there is a student who can write it all down. Socrates, of course, didn't write anything down, but he had a student, Plato. Unfortunately, Plato had Aristotle, which took it in a different direction. But, if there was another mystic like himself as one of his students, then who knows what would have come from that. And certainly the Neoplatonists tried to pick up that strand and carry it through, and they gave us, their beautiful metaphysics that they have written out for us and that blessed us with. So we try as best we can to hold on to that vision, and of course they themselves had a vision of their own, and so now we're trying to hold on to their vision, right? And then, of course, also in our own experience, those who've had some degree of this kind of experience that we're talking about here, the spiritual experience, there's that fading. You stay in that glow for a few weeks or even months, but eventually your energy will settle and you'll fall back into your old patterns. And so you want to hold on to that, what feels like a fading vision. And so there are many levels that you can understand this on a personal level, on a more of a macro level. And then there is also, because this is an analogy to the city-state, it means there's also on the social level as well, the governmental level. The stranger goes on to say, is it any wonder that under these makeshift constitutions of ours, hosts of ills have arisen, and more must be expected in the future? I didn't read that very smoothly, but I think you got it. So under these various constitutions, these various 5 that were described here that fall short of the ideal, under these, hosts of ills have arisen, and more must be expected in the future. They all rest on the sandy foundation of action according to law and custom without real scientific insight. So in some cases, you're trying your best to follow the Constitution, but If you don't have that insight for yourself, you're going to fall short somewhere or another. Another art that worked on such a foundation would obviously ruin all that it sought to build up. But something even more remarkable than these besetting ills is the sheer native strength a city possesses nevertheless. For all our cities, as we know, have been subject to such ills for many generations now, and yet some of them have not come to ruin, but still stand firm. However, we see many instances of cities going down like sinking ships to their destruction. There have been such wrecks in the past, and there surely will be others in the future, caused by the wickedness of captains and crews alike. For these are guilty men, whose sin is supreme ignorance of what matters most. They are men who know little or nothing of real political truth, and yet they consider themselves to know it from end to end, and suppose that they are better instructed in this art than in any other. Very true. What he's describing here can again be taken on multiple levels. We can see here that even though the shining lights in the Platonic tradition, for example, have been few and far between, the ones that do stand out seem to keep the whole thing going. And those practitioners who fall short of the ideal nevertheless see value in it and keep it going. You can also see that within yourself. You can take the same analogy within yourself. You can see that even if you do fall short of the ideal, you're still growing and benefiting from the practice. And you're looking forward to the day when your wisdom does mature and you're able then to be a statesman in your own right. And by the way, this word sin is actually agnoion in Greek, which is the negative form of gnosis. And so this is ignorance more accurately. All of these imperfect constitutions are difficult to live under, but we might ask ourselves which of them is hardest to bear and which is most tolerable. Ought we perhaps to examine this matter, though it is not directly relevant to our appointed theme? After all, one must remember that, speaking quite generally, the aim of all the actions of men everywhere is to secure for themselves the most tolerable life they can. Then we can hardly help considering the question. There is one of three constitutions which you must regard as being at once the hardest to live under and the easiest. Well, how do you mean? I just want to remind you that at the beginning of this supplementary discussion, we enumerated three constitutions: the rule of one, the rule of the few, and the rule of the many. We did. Divide each of three into two. Each of the three, it should be. Dividing each of the three into two, let us make 6, having first separated the true constitution from all, calling it the 7th. How shall we divide the 3 others? Under the rule of one, we get kingly rule and tyranny. Under the rule of the few, as we said, come the auspicious form of it, aristocracy and also oligarchy. As for the subdividing of democracy, though we gave both forms of it one name previously, we must now treat it as twofold. How is this? How can it be divided? Well, by the same division as the others, even though the word democracy proves to be doing double duty. Rule according to law is as possible under democracy as under the other constitutions. Yes, it is. This division of democracy into two kinds was not serviceable previously, as we indicated at the time, for we were seeking then to define a perfect constitution. Now, however, we have excluded the perfect constitution from our reckoning, and we have before us those that have to serve us as constitutions in default of it. In this group, we find the principle of obedience to law or contravention of law, dividing each type of ruler into two types. So it seems from the argument that was put forward just now. The rule of one man, if it has been kept within the traces, so to speak, by the written rules we call laws, is the best of all the six. But when it is lawless, it is hard and the most grievous to have to endure. So it would seem. As for the rule of a few, just as the few constitute a middle term between the one and the many, so we regard the rule of the few as the middle potency for good or ill. The rule of the many is weakest in every way. It is not capable of any real good or any serious evil as compared with the other two. This is because in a democracy, sovereignty has been divided out in small portions among a large number of rulers. If, therefore, all three constitutions are law-abiding, democracy is the worst of the three. But if all three flout the laws, democracy is the best of them. Thus, if all constitutions are unprincipled, the best thing is to live in a democracy. But when constitutions are lawful and ordered, democracy is the least desirable, and monarchy, the first of the six, is by far the best to live under. Unless, of course, the seventh is possible, for that must always be exalted, like a god among mortals, above all other constitutions. Okay, so there again, he reiterated why we need these laws and why this is the second best. Why we should have a constitution and why he considers this the second best. Things do seem to work out in this way, and so we must take your advice and act as you say. Therefore, all who take part in one of these governments, apart from the one based on real knowledge, are to be distinguished from the true statesmen. They are not statesmen. They are party leaders, leaders of bogus governments, and themselves as bogus as their systems. The supreme imitators and tricksters, they are of all sophists the arch-sophists. Okay, so again, I think this idea must always be taken not just on the surface level, but then also think about that analog within your soul. It seems to me that the wheel has come full circle, now that the title of sophist goes to those who most deserve it, to the men who get themselves called political leaders. So this fantastic pageant that seemed like some strange mask of centaurs or some band of satyrs stands revealed for what it is. At much pains we have succeeded at last in distinguishing them and setting them apart, as we must, from all true practice of statesmanship. So we see. There remains another task, and it is even more difficult because the class to be set apart is closer akin to the kingly ruler, and also in itself harder to discern clearly. It seems to me that we have reached a point where we have to act like gold refiners. How so? We are told that at the first stage of their work, they separate off earth and stones and much else from the ore. When these are gone, there still remain those precious substances akin to gold, which are so combined with it as to be separable only in the furnace. I mean bronze and silver, and sometimes adamant as well. These are removed only with difficulty as the metal is tried in the refining fire, until at last the process yields the sight of unalloyed gold separated off by itself. Yes, they do say that refining is done like that. It looks as though we are in a like situation. We have separated off the elements which are quite different from statesmanship, the elements which are quite foreign and repugnant to it. But there still remain the precious elements which are akin to it. These include the art of generalship, the art of administering justice, and that department of the art of public speaking which is closely allied to the kingly art. This last persuades men to do what is right, and therefore it takes its share in controlling what goes on in a true community. How can we best separate these arts also from statesmanship, and so bring out the nature of the statesman as such, in his essential character? That, after all, is our present object. And I might also remind you that when you're doing dialectic, also you're looking for the essential nature or character of that which truly is. Clearly, we must make the attempt by one means or another. If trying will do it, he shall be shown in his true character. Music will provide us with an example which will help us in our task. I will begin by putting a question to you. What is it? There is such a thing as learning the principles of music or the principles of any of the crafts, is there not? Yes. But are we willing to admit that there exists an art of a higher order, also concerned with this process of acquiring special skills? This second art is the one whose province is to decide whether or not we ought to learn any particular art. Okay, so now we're looking for a higher order of art. I'll make it green. To decide whether or not we ought to even learn this art. Is it even worth doing? Yes, we will attest the existence of an art of this higher order. Well, we must also agree then that it is to be distinguished from all arts of the lower order. Yes. Ought there to be no priority at all as between these two orders of art? On the other hand, if there is to be priority, must the lower order control the higher, or the higher guide and control the lower? Well, the higher order should control the lower. So last week I talked about mastership in the ideal sense, and this touches on that. This is what he's talking about here. Your decision is then that the art which decides whether we learn a skill or not ought to have control of the art which actually teaches us that skill. Yes, certainly. Then in the same way, the art which decides whether persuasion should or should not be used ought to control the operation of the art of persuasion itself. Undoubtedly. Which is the art to which we must assign the task of persuading the general mass of the population by telling them suitable stories rather than by giving them formal instruction. Well, I should say that it is obvious that this is the province to be assigned to rhetoric. But to which art must we assign the function of deciding whether in any particular situation we must proceed by persuasion or by coercive measures against a group of men, or whether it is right to take no action at all? The art which can teach us how to decide that will be the art which controls rhetoric and the art of public speaking. This activity can be none other than the work of the statesman, I suggest. Excellent. That is exactly what it is. So the art which controls rhetoric and the art of public speaking. So you've got rhetoric, and then we're now saying that statesmanship is the art that controls rhetoric. Oratory, it seems, has been quickly set apart from statesmanship. It is distinct from statesmanship, and yet it's auxiliary. Yes. Now we must consider the working of another art. Which is that? Consider the taking of decisions on military strategy once war has been declared by the state on an enemy state. What shall we say about this? Is such decision governed by no art at all, Or shall we say there is most certainly an art involved here? How could we dream of saying that no art is concerned? Surely generalship in the whole art of warfare operates precisely in this field. In the whole art of warfare, let me highlight that. But which is the art which possesses the knowledge and capacity to form a reasoned decision whether to fight or to settle a dispute on friendly terms? Is this the work of generalship, or does it belong to another art? Well, consistency to our earlier argument requires us to say that it is a different one which is involved. So if our view here is to be consistent with our earlier views on the place of rhetoric, we must decide that the second art controls generalship. It controls generalship. What art can we attempt to enthrone as queen over that mighty and dreadful art, the art of war in all its range, except the rule of truly royal rule? None other. Then we must not describe the art that generals practice as statesmanship, for it proves to be but a servant of statesmanship. Okay, so you see the pattern here. Apparently that is so. Now turn to another art, and let us consider the activity of judges who make straight judgments. Okay, so now we have the judges, and you can probably guess where it's going to go. Does its province extend beyond the sphere of the mutual contractual obligations of the citizens? It has to act in this sphere by judging what is just or unjust according to the standards set up for it and embodied in the legal rules which it has received from the kingly lawgiver. It shows its peculiar virtue by coming to an impartial decision on the conflicting claims it examines, by refusing to pervert the lawgiver's ordinance through yielding to bribery or threats or sentimental appeals, and by rising above all considerations of personal friendship or enmity. Yes, that is so. You have given us, sir, a succinct account of the juryman's function and of his duty. We find, then, that the power of the judges is a lesser thing than the power of the king. The judge guards the law and serves the king. So it would seem. Okay, so again, that same relationship here. And there again, you see the idea of the master-servant relationship in more of an ideal, or at least in the pattern of the ideal. Okay. If you will view the three arts we have spoken of as a group with a common character, you will be bound to see that none of them has turned out to be itself the art of statesmanship. This is because it is not the province of the real kingly art to act for itself, but rather to control the work of the arts which instruct us in the methods of action. The kingly art controls them according to its power to perceive the right occasions for undertaking and setting in motion the great enterprises of state. The other arts must do what they are told to do by the kingly art. Precisely so. So in other words, they each have their own particular wisdom over their particular area, but it is the kingly art that has wisdom in itself, in general, and that touches wisdom itself. The three arts we have just treated in detail may not control one another. They may not even control themselves, in fact. Each has its special field of action, and each is entitled to the name which designates its proper sphere. So it would seem. There is an art which controls all these arts. It is concerned with the laws and with all that belongs to the life of the community. It weaves all into its unified fabric with perfect skill. It is a universal art, and so we call it by a name of universal scope. That name is one which I believe to belong to this art and to this alone, the name of statesmanship. Yes, I agree absolutely. So concerned with the laws and all that belongs to the life of the community. Now, on the political level, very easy to understand, but you also want to relate it to the soul. Remember that analog to the soul. You can never let it out of your mind, because that's what I think he's really talking about here. Is he's talking about those divine laws that you follow to the best of your ability, and those who have touched it directly and uh, have that memory that they hold on to, that paradigm in the soul as it's described as in the Republic, to hold on to that, to always look to that. That is what it means to follow the laws. And it belongs to the life of the community. And remember, the analog would be to the soul, to the life of the soul. Now, this idea of weaving, it weaves it all into a unified fabric. So this imagery brings us back to the idea of weaving. Remember, some weeks ago, he introduced weaving as an analog to statesmanship, but then he kind of dropped it and we haven't seen it since. Well, now he's going to come back to it, and this is how he's going to wrap up the dialogue. So I hope that you'll join me next week, which will be the final reading of the Statesman. We'll see how he wraps it all up, how he ties it all together, weaves it all together into one final ending. So if you have any questions or comments, please put those below. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are as we go through this dialogue. There's just so much here, so much going on, and so much to think about. So please share your thoughts in the comments section below. And as always, I thank you for watching. Till next time.